There's a single sentence that this boy will spend his entire life trying to live up to, and it will cost him almost everyone he ever loves. He'll whisper it to himself on rooftops at 3 in the morning. He'll bleed for it in alleys nobody ever cleans. He'll give up his happiness for it, his name for it, the one great love of his life for it. And in the end, he'll let a part of his own soul be quietly erased so that the sentence can stay true. The sentence is about power and what owning it demands of you. And here's the part nobody warns you about. By the time he finally understands that sentence all the way down to the floor, by the time he's saved more lives than any single human being in his city's history, he won't be standing in the sun being thanked. He'll be standing alone on a fire escape with a mask in his hands, looking down at a life full of empty chairs, quietly wondering whether the most responsible person in the world is allowed to be this tired.
That's not how stories about heroes are supposed to feel.
But this was never really a story about a hero, not the way you think. It only looked like one from a distance, in the daylight, when his face was covered. So let me take you back. Before the city learned his name and decided to hate it. Before the funerals stacked so high he stopped being able to count them. Before the boy who could lift a bus over his head learned that the thing he could never lift was the weight of one single mistake. Let me take you back to a kid standing at the back of a classroom doing the most dangerous thing a lonely person can possibly do. He's wishing he were someone else. His name is Peter Parker, and by the time you understand him, really understand him, the way his whole life is about to make you understand him, you're going to have to ask yourself a question that everyone who ever loved him spent years too afraid to ask out loud. What does it actually cost to do the right thing every single time, forever? And what happens to a person who decides he isn't allowed to stop? We've got a long road ahead of us before that makes sense. So let's start where it started, in a quiet house in Queens, with a boy who already knew what it felt like to be left behind. The first thing you have to understand about Peter Parker is that he was an orphan twice before he was old enough to drive. His parents were gone early. He never really got the chance to know them. There were photographs, a few foggy half-memories, the kind of fragments a child stitches into a story to keep from feeling the whole. What he had instead, what raised him, was a small house on a quiet street and the two people who lived in it, his Uncle Ben and his Aunt May. They weren't his parents. They were better than that in a way, because they chose him. A middle-aged couple with no children of their own suddenly handed a grieving boy, and instead of treating him like an obligation, they treated him like the answer to a question they hadn't known they were asking. Ben especially. Ben looked at this nervous, brilliant, fatherless kid and decided to pour everything he had into him. He wasn't a rich man. He worked hard, came home tired, and still found the energy to sit on the back porch with Peter and talk. Really talk, the way most adults are too busy to. About science, about the news, about what kind of man you become when nobody's watching. Ben had this gentle, unhurried way of teaching that never felt like teaching, so that years later, Peter wouldn't even be able to point to the lessons. They'd just be inside him, load-bearing, holding up the whole structure of who he was, without him ever noticing they were there. That's the cruelest part of what's coming, by the way, so hold on to it. The lessons Ben planted in this boy are going to define every single choice Peter makes for the rest of his life. And Ben is never going to know it. He won't live long enough to find out he was right. But that's later. We'll come back for it. We always come back for it. For now, picture the boy, skinny, quiet, smarter than everyone in the room, and somehow more invisible because of it. Peter was the kid who actually loved school, which in the savage social ecosystem of a teenager is roughly equivalent to wearing a sign that says, "Please torment me." He carried his books like a shield. He understood physics and chemistry and biology in a way that genuinely thrilled him. He'd light up explaining something, eyes bright, words tumbling out faster than his mouth could keep up. And then he'd notice the faces around him going flat with boredom or curling with contempt, and the light would go out and he'd shrink back down into himself. He went to Midtown High. And at Midtown High, there was a particular kind of hell reserved for boys like Peter. His name was Flash Thompson. Big, athletic, popular, the golden idiot every school manufactures. The one who figured out early that the fastest way to feel tall is to find someone smaller and stand on them. Flash made a hobby out of Peter. The shoves in the hallway, the names, the casual public humiliations performed for an audience that laughed because laughing along felt safer than being next. And Peter took it. He took it the way you take weather, like it was just the climate of being him, something that happened to your body that your mind learned to stand somewhere outside of. Here's the thing about that, though. The thing nobody at that school could have guessed. Peter Parker wasn't weak. He was just powerless. And those are not the same thing, even though the world treats them like they are. There was a fire in this kid. There had to be, to survive that much daily smallness without curdling into something bitter. He wanted to matter. He wanted, more than almost anything, to be looked at and seen as something other than a punchline. He just had no way to make it happen. No size, no status, no power. Only a brain that the world kept telling him didn't count. So he did what powerless people do. He waited. He kept his head down and told himself that someday it would be different. Someday the things he was good at would matter. Someday he'd be more than the boy who got shoved into lockers. The universe heard that wish. And the universe, as we're going to learn over and over again in this story, has a habit of granting wishes in the cruelest possible way. There was one bright spot in the gray. A girl. Of course there was a girl. Her name was Liz, and there were others over the years whose faces blur into the general ache of being 15 and unseen. But the point isn't any specific name yet. The point is that Peter was a romantic. Underneath the science and the shyness, he was a boy who wanted, desperately, to be wanted, and who had absolutely no idea how to make that happen, and who watched the people he liked drift toward the Flash Thompsons of the world with a quiet, swallowed heartbreak that he never let anyone see. Remember that about him. The capacity for love was always there, oversized, almost embarrassing in how much he had to give. It's going to be the best thing about him and the thing that destroys him, sometimes in the same afternoon. Because the more love a person carries, the more the world has to take from them. And the world is about to start taking. For now, though, hold the picture in your mind. A boy in a house full of warmth and a school full of cruelty. An aunt who worried over him and an uncle who believed in him. A mind like an engine running at full speed inside a body nobody respected. A heart with no outlet. A wish for power made in the dark, the way kids make wishes they assume will never come true. He was about to get exactly what he wished for. And it was going to be the worst thing that ever happened to him. We just have to get him to one ordinary field trip first. A school science demonstration. A dim room. A spider that nobody noticed, hanging on a thread, lit up by a kind of radiation that shouldn't exist. Nothing about that day looked important. That's how the important days always disguise themselves. The spider was dying when it bit him. That detail matters more than it seems. It had been caught in the path of whatever experiment was being demonstrated that day. Irradiated, poisoned, already on its way out of the world. And on its way down, on its last thread of life, it landed on the back of Peter Parker's hand and sank everything it had left into him. A small, hot point of pain. Peter shook it off, barely registered it, rubbed the spot, and went home feeling sick and feverish, assuming he'd caught something. He had. just not anything a doctor could name. That night, his body started to rewrite itself, and when Peter woke up, the world had changed its physics around him.
He could feel things he'd never felt, a low electric hum at the back of his skull that warned him of danger a half second before it arrived. Like the universe had handed him a sixth sense and a reason to never feel safe again. His reflexes were impossible. His balance was perfect. When he reached out and touched a wall, his fingers stuck to it. And he found he could climb it like it was the floor, defying everything he'd ever learned in the science classes he loved. And the strength. The strength was the part that broke his mind open. This skinny, bullied, overlooked kid could now lift several tons over his head. He could leap across rooftops. The boy who had spent his entire life being the smallest, weakest thing in every room he entered was suddenly, secretly, one of the strongest people alive. Imagine what that does to a person who has been powerless his whole life. Now here's the part of the story that people forget, the part that's actually the key to understanding everything Peter Parker becomes. Because if you only know him from a distance, you think the spider made him a hero. It didn't. The spider made him a teenager with superpowers. And a teenager with superpowers and a lifetime of resentment does not immediately think about saving the world. He thinks about himself. That was the first thing Peter did. He thought about himself. And honestly, who could blame him? For years, the world had told him he was nothing, and now the world was wrong. And there was something intoxicating about holding a secret that made every Flash Thompson on Earth a joke. He didn't run out to fight crime, he ran out to get rich and to get seen. Because the other thing you have to understand about Peter is that money was real in that house. Ben and May weren't wealthy. There were bills that whispered through the walls, a quiet tightness around the edges of their kindness, the constant low-grade math of people who love each other and are barely making it. Peter saw that. He always saw that. So when he discovered he had a body that could do impossible things, the first plan that formed in his mind was beautifully, painfully practical. He'd make money. He'd help. He'd finally be the one taking care of them instead of being one more mouth to feed. You see what I'm doing here? I'm telling you he was selfish. And in the same breath, I'm telling you he was generous. Both are true. That's the contradiction at the center of this boy, and it never goes away. Even his vanity had love tangled into it. He built a costume, a homemade thing, half theater, half disguise, because some instinct told him to hide his face. And then he did the single most important piece of engineering in his entire life, and almost nobody gives him credit for it. The webs. Everyone assumes the spider gave him the webs. It didn't. Peter Parker, this overlooked kid the world dismissed as a nerd, invented a fluid that could shoot from his wrists, strong enough to hold his weight, that dissolved cleanly after an hour. He designed the mechanisms himself. The thing the world would one day fear and worship. The web slinging, the signature, the impossible swinging between skyscrapers. That came out of the mind everybody had spent years telling him didn't matter. He was always a genius. The spider just gave the world a reason to finally notice. So there he was. Masked, gloved, strong, anonymous. And he took it to a wrestling ring of all places, because there was a cash prize for any amateur who could last in the ring with a professional. Peter walked in as a nobody and threw a grown man around like a stuffed toy, and the crowd went wild, and the money was real. And for the first time in his life, Peter Parker felt the specific high of being applauded. A promoter saw dollar signs, put him on television. The costume got better, the act got slicker, and almost overnight, this anonymous masked performer became a small sensation. He was famous. He was rich, by his standards. He was finally somebody. And it had nothing to do with helping anyone. It was a show. It was him, finally, getting the thing he'd wished for in the dark. And for a little while, it was glorious.
I want to be honest about that, because the story always rushes past this part to get to the tragedy, and it shouldn't. For a few days, Peter Parker got to be happy in the dumbest, most ordinary way.
He got to be a cocky kid with a secret. He got to feel powerful and admired and untouchable. He'd swing home grinning under his mask, money in his pocket, the bullies of the world reduced to insects beneath him. And then one night, at the studio, after a show, the moment arrived that splits his entire life into a before and an after. He just didn't know it yet. Nobody ever does. There was a robbery. Some thief had broken into the production office and grabbed the cash and was sprinting down the hallway straight past Peter with a security guard yelling after him to "Stop him! Stop him! You can catch him!" And Peter, strong enough to flatten the man with a flick of his hand, fast enough to web him to the wall before he took 2 more steps, Peter just watched him go, let him run right past, didn't lift a finger. The guard was furious, demanded to know why he'd let the guy escape when he so obviously could have stopped him. And Peter, riding high, full of himself, full of the new and poisonous belief that the world had never done anything for him, so why should he do anything for it, gave the answer that's going to haunt him until the day he dies. He said it wasn't his job. He said catching criminals was somebody else's problem. He said he was looking out for number 1 because nobody had ever looked out for him. He turned and walked away, pleased with himself, and the thief ran off into the night, and Peter went home. I need you to sit inside how small this moment was. Not heroic, not villainous, just a tired teenager being a little selfish, a little smug, a little human, in a hallway for about 4 seconds. The kind of thing every single person watching this has done some version of. We've all let something slide. We've all decided just once that it wasn't our problem. The terror of Peter Parker's story is that he's about to learn what happens when one of those 4-second decisions has a price tag attached that you could never have imagined. Because that thief he let run, that man with the cash who sprinted past him into the dark, Peter is going to see him one more time, and the next time, he won't walk away. The next time, he'll be standing in his own home, looking down at the body of the person who loved him most in the entire world. But that comes tomorrow. For now, Peter sleeps well. The famous masked kid, money in the drawer, the whole world finally going his way. It's the last good night's sleep he's ever going to get. It happened on an ordinary evening, in an ordinary house, the way the worst things always do. Peter came home to find police cars outside, their lights painting the quiet street in slow red sweeps, and a neighbor's hand on his shoulder, and the particular silence that falls over people when they're about to tell a child that his world has ended. There'd been a break-in, a burglar had gotten into the house, and Uncle Ben, gentle, patient, unhurried Ben, the man who taught him everything on a back porch without ever calling it a lesson, Ben had been shot. He was already gone. Just like that. The one person who'd looked at Peter and seen something worth believing in. Gone. In his own living room, over money that wasn't worth a single hair on his head. Something in Peter didn't break so much as ignite. The grief and the rage fused into one white-hot thing, and he didn't cry, not yet, not where anyone could see. He put on the mask, the performer's costume, the wrestling outfit, the thing he'd built for applause. He pulled it on for the first time as something else entirely, and he went hunting. Because the police had a lead. The killer had fled to an old warehouse on the waterfront, and Peter got there first, moving across the rooftops in a way no human being had ever moved, propelled by a fury that made his impossible strength feel almost too small for what he wanted to do with it. He found the man. He fought him.
Barely a fight, really. The burglar never stood a chance against what Peter had become. He pinned him, ready to deliver him to justice, ready to look the murderer of his uncle in the eyes. And then the light hit the man's face, and Peter recognized him. It was the thief, the one from the studio. The one who'd run right past him in the hallway. The one Peter could have stopped with a flick of his wrist and chose not to. Because it wasn't his job. Because he was looking out for number one. Because nobody had ever looked out for him. That man, the exact same man. He'd let him go free, and that free man had walked into Peter's own home and murdered the person Peter loved most on this earth. I want you to really understand what just landed on this kid, because everything he becomes, every sacrifice, every act of mercy, every sleepless night for the rest of his life grows directly out of this single, unbearable piece of arithmetic. Uncle Ben did not have to die. There was a version of that evening where Peter stopped a thief in a hallway the way anyone could have, the way a decent person would have, and the thief went to jail, and Ben lived to be an old man on a back porch. That version was right there. Peter held it in his hands and threw it away because he couldn't be bothered. And the universe, with its monstrous sense of symmetry, took the exact gift Peter had refused to give and weaponized it against him. His selfishness didn't just fail to help a stranger, it looped all the way back around and killed his family. That's the wound. That's the thing underneath everything. Most heroes are forged by something done to them. Peter was forged by something he failed to do, and there is no scarier engine to build a life on, because you can't fight it, you can't get revenge on it, you can't punch the person responsible. The person responsible is you, and you have to keep living inside your own skin every single day, carrying the certainty that the worst thing that ever happened to your family was your fault. He knelt there in that warehouse, mask on, the killer webbed and waiting for the police, and the lesson Ben had been quietly teaching him for years finally arrived all at once, fully formed, written in his uncle's blood. That having power isn't the prize. That being able to do something is exactly the thing that makes you responsible for doing it. That the strength to act and the obligation to act are the same strength. And if you have it and you don't use it, then everything that happens because you held back is on you. Power and responsibility. The capacity to act and the duty that comes welded to it, inseparable, forever. He understood it now in a way that would never let him go. Not as a nice idea, as a sentence handed down at his own trial, with a sentence he'd be serving for the rest of his life. Peter Parker went home that night a different person than the one who'd woken up that morning. The cocky kid was dead. He'd died in that warehouse, next to the man he'd let live. And in his place was something heavier and lonelier and far more dangerous to the criminals of New York, and far more dangerous to Peter himself, though it would take him years to understand that part. He'd wished in the dark to be powerful. He got his wish, and the very first thing his power did was teach him that he could never, ever rest again. So Spider-Man was born. Not in the wrestling ring. Right there, in the grief, in the guilt, in the silence of a house that used to have Ben in it. From that night forward, the costume stopped being a costume. It became a vow. Every criminal he stopped, every life he saved, every night he spent swinging through the cold air over a city that didn't know his name, all of it was Peter trying to pay down a debt that could never be paid. Trying to make sure that no one else's uncle died because Peter Parker decided it wasn't his job. He's going to be paying that debt for the rest of this video. He never finishes. You can't. That's the whole tragedy. The debt has no bottom. And here is where the universe twists the knife in a way so cruel, it's almost funny. Peter still had to take care of Aunt May. They were poorer than ever now, with Ben gone, and the medical bills, and a widow's grief, and a teenage boy who needed feeding. Peter had a brain that could have made him rich a dozen ways, but he was a kid, and what he had right now, immediately, that paid cash, was a body that did impossible things and a face nobody could see. So he went back to making money off Spider-Man, but not in the ring.
He bought a camera, and he started taking photographs of himself in action. The only photographer in the world who could get those shots, because the photographer and the subject were the same person. And he sold them to a newspaper, the Daily Bugle, run by a man named J. Jonah Jameson. And Jameson hated Spider-Man, loathed him, built an entire crusade out of loathing him. To Jameson, this masked figure swinging around the city was a menace, a vigilante, a fraud, a threat, a costumed lunatic who had no business taking the law into his own hands. He ran headline after headline, tearing Spider-Man apart, turning the public against him, branding the kid who was killing himself to protect them as a danger they should fear. And do you understand the exquisite cruelty of it? Peter Parker was being paid by the Daily Bugle to take photographs that the Daily Bugle then used to destroy Spider-Man's reputation. He was funding his own character assassination. He was selling the rope they used to hang him because he needed the money to keep his aunt's lights on. This is the irony that defines his entire public life, so let it sink all the way in. The city's most devoted protector spent his career being hated by the very people he bled for. He'd pull a family out of a burning building at midnight and read in the paper the next morning that he probably set the fire. He'd stop a robbery, save a hostage, catch a falling child, and the headline would call him a public menace. The more good he did, the more the world recoiled. And he could never explain why, because explaining why would mean taking off the mask, and taking off the mask would mean everyone he loved became a target. So he just took it. The way he'd once taken the shoves from Flash Thompson in the hallway. Because here's the terrible thing the world never understood about Spider-Man, the thing that's the secret beating heart of his whole existence. He didn't do it to be loved. He didn't do it to be thanked. He'd already learned, at the worst possible age, that doing the right thing and being rewarded for it are two completely separate things that the universe is under no obligation to connect. He did it because Ben was dead, and because he had the power to stop it from happening to someone else, and because a sentence written in blood doesn't care whether anybody claps. He became the loneliest kind of hero there is, the kind who's hated for saving you. And he showed up anyway, every single night, for people who'd have crossed the street to avoid him. Hold that, we're going to watch the world test exactly how much of that he can take. Now we have to talk about the double life, because the double life is the slow poison of Peter Parker's entire existence, and it works on him a little more every single year. On paper, it sounds thrilling. A secret identity. By night, a hero swinging over the rooftops, by day, an ordinary student. But strip the romance off it and look at what it actually is, and it's a machine for manufacturing loneliness. Because every relationship Peter has, every single one, has a locked room inside it that he can never let anyone into. He can't tell Aunt May why he's always late, always bruised, always exhausted, always disappearing. So she worries and she nags, and she assumes he's irresponsible. This woman who lost her husband and is terrified of losing the boy. And he can't give her the one piece of information that would let her understand him. He has to let her think less of him to keep her safe. That's the trade he makes 1,000 times over. He lets the people he loves think he's flaky, unreliable, a disappointment, a no-show, because the truth would put a target on their backs. He chooses their safety over their good opinion, again and again, and it costs him a little piece of himself every time. He goes off to college eventually. He's far too brilliant not to. And you'd think that would be his escape, the place where the science kid finally gets to belong. And there's some of that, but the pattern follows him. Because the pattern isn't about the school, it's about the mask. He's the guy who misses the study group because somewhere across town a building was on fire. He's the boyfriend who vanishes mid-date because his spider sense lit up. He's the friend who's always almost there and never quite arrives. And he can never, ever say why. So the people around him fill in the blank with the worst available explanation. And Peter just absorbs it, the way he absorbs everything. He saves the city, and the city calls him a menace. He saves his loved ones, and his loved ones call him unreliable. The man cannot win for winning. The better the hero, the worse the human looks. And then there are the people who come into his orbit at school. Two of them matter more than all the rest. The first is a young man named Harry Osborn. Wealthy, insecure, desperate for approval. The son of a powerful, distant, terrifying father who'd built an empire and somehow never found the time to love his own boy. Harry latched onto Peter the way lonely people latch onto someone steady. And against the odds, the rich kid and the poor genius became real friends. Best friends. Roommates eventually. And that friendship is going to become one of the great loves and one of the great wounds of Peter's life, in a way Peter cannot possibly see coming. Because the thing that's going to destroy it is the man standing in the shadows behind Harry, his father, Norman Osborn. Write that name down somewhere in the back of your mind. He's going to matter more than almost anyone. And the second person, the one who walks into the story and changes the whole color of it, is a girl named Gwen Stacy. I have to slow down for Gwen. Because if you only know Peter Parker from the outside, you might think the great love of his life was someone else, someone who came later. And we'll get there. That's a real and beautiful story too. But Gwen was first, and Gwen was different. And to understand the size of what happens to Peter, you have to first understand exactly what he had. She was smart, genuinely, formidably smart, a science student in her own right, someone who could meet Peter on his own ground, who didn't find his brilliance boring or intimidating, but thrilling. She was kind. She was beautiful in that quiet, luminous way that sneaks up on you. And she saw Peter. Not Spider-Man, who she didn't know about, but Peter, the real one, the shy one, the one with the locked rooms, and she chose him anyway, flakiness and absences and all. For the first time since Ben died, Peter let himself believe he might actually get to be happy, get to be a person, not just a debt being slowly repaid, get to have a life with someone in it who wasn't constantly slipping away from him. Remember that he let himself believe it. That's the part that's going to matter. He lowered his guard. He let himself want something. The universe has been waiting this whole time for him to do exactly that. And here's a detail that's going to twist the knife later, so plant it now. Gwen's father was a man named George Stacy, a police captain, a good cop, an honest one, a decent man, and crucially, one of the very few people in the city who didn't buy Jameson's crusade, who looked at Spider-Man's actions instead of the headlines, and quietly concluded that this masked kid was on the side of the angels. Captain Stacy respected Spider-Man. He may even have suspected, in that careful way smart older men suspect things, exactly who was under the mask. Hold on to Captain Stacy. He's important, and he's not going to be around as long as you'd like. While all of this is happening, the friendships, the love, the fragile sketch of a normal life, Peter is fighting a war. And his enemies are not random. That's the thing I want you to notice. Almost every great villain in Peter Parker's life is a funhouse mirror version of Peter himself, a reflection of the man he could have become if one or two things had gone differently.
The story is constantly, quietly asking him, what makes you different from them? And it never quite lets him answer. Look at Otto Octavius, Dr. Octopus, a brilliant scientist, exactly the kind of brilliant Peter is, the kind Peter dreamed of becoming, whose work fused mechanical arms to his nervous system, and whose mind broke in the accident, and who took all that genius and pointed it at the world like a gun. Otto is Peter without the conscience. Peter's intellect, untethered from Ben's lessons, free of the sentence written in blood. Every time Peter beats him, he's beating a version of the future he narrowly escaped. Look at the lizard, Kurt Connors.
A good man, a scientist trying to do good, trying to regrow his own lost arm, whose experiment turned him into a monster he couldn't control. That's the nightmare that lives rent-free in Peter's chest. The fear that the very power that was supposed to help could turn you into the thing you're fighting. That science, that ambition, that one experiment could swallow the man and leave only the beast. Look at the Sandman, the Vulture, the Rhino, the whole grim parade. Men twisted by power they couldn't handle, by anger they couldn't set down, by the exact same forces working on Peter every night. He's surrounded by mirrors, and the only thing standing between him and the reflection is a dead man's voice in his head, telling him what power is actually for. But the deepest mirror of all, the one that's going to cut closest to the bone, isn't a scientist or a monster. It's the father of his best friend. It's the man who's been standing in the shadows this whole time, watching, experimenting, slowly losing his mind. Norman Osborn was about to drink a formula that would make him stronger and faster and more brilliant, and shatter whatever was left of his sanity. He was about to become something the city had no name for yet. A goblin, a green, grinning, cackling nightmare on a flying glider, with a bag full of explosives and a mind that had finally, completely come apart. And the cruelest detail of all, the one the universe must have spent years setting up, is that Norman Osborn is Harry's father. Peter's best friend's dad. The two halves of Peter's life, the human and the heroic, the one he protects and the one he fights, are about to crash into each other through a single family. And there will be no clean way out. Whatever Spider-Man does to the Green Goblin, he does to Harry's father. Whatever the Green Goblin does to Spider-Man, he does to Peter's whole world. Peter doesn't know any of this yet. He's a young man in love, with a best friend and a future and a girl who sees him. He thinks the hard part of his life might finally be behind him. It's not. The hard part of his life hasn't even started. The first crack came with Captain Stacy. There was a battle in the streets. There was always a battle. Peter's life was an unbroken chain of them. And in the chaos, falling debris threatened a child. George Stacy, the honest cop, the decent man, the father of the girl Peter loved, did the thing decent men do without thinking. He moved to save the kid. And the rubble came down on him instead. Peter got to him, cradled this dying man in the wreckage. And in his last moments, Captain Stacy looked up at the masked figure holding him and said the thing that confirmed he'd known all along. He used Peter's name. Not Spider-Man's. Peter's. He'd seen through the mask, this clever, careful old cop, and he'd kept the secret to himself. And now, dying, he spent some of his final breath on a single request. He asked Peter to look after Gwen, to take care of his daughter. And then he was gone. The second father figure Peter had lost. The second good man to die in his arms or near his hands. The second time the universe took someone decent and made Peter watch. But it gets worse, in the specific way that everything in Peter's life gets worse. Because Gwen didn't know. She didn't know Peter was Spider-Man, and she didn't know her father had figured it out. And in her grief,
casting around for someone to blame. She landed on Spider-Man.
She decided the masked menace had gotten her father killed.
So now Peter had to stand next to the woman he loved while she hated, with her whole broken heart, the secret half of himself, and he couldn't say a word. He couldn't comfort her with the truth. He had to hold her while she despised the very thing he was, and swallow it, and keep the mask on, even in the privacy of his own grief. That's the double life squeezing him from both directions at once. He'd promised a dying man he'd protect Gwen, and the only way to keep that promise was to let her go on hating the part of him that could have. You'd think that would be the bottom. It wasn't. We're not even close to the bottom. Because Norman Osborn, Harry's father, the man behind the Green Goblin, finally did the thing Peter had spent his whole life dreading. In one of their battles, the Goblin learned the truth. He found out that Spider-Man was Peter Parker.
The one secret that protected everyone Peter loved. The secret he'd let his own aunt think he was a screw-up to preserve. The secret he'd kept from the love of his life, even as she hated his other face. That secret was now in the hands of the most unstable, most vicious, most personally entangled enemy he had. The Goblin didn't just know Spider-Man, he knew Peter. He knew where Peter lived. He knew who Peter loved. And a man whose mind has shattered, who knows exactly where to cut, will always, always go for the people. It happened on a bridge, high over the dark water, the city glittering cold in the distance. The Goblin had taken Gwen Stacy, snatched her, this innocent girl who didn't even know what game she'd been pulled into, and carried her up to the top of the tower, and he stood there grinning that broken grin, dangling Peter's whole reason for hoping out over the long drop, because he understood the one thing about Peter Parker that the whole rest of the world had missed. You don't hurt a man like Peter by hitting him. You hurt him by taking what he loves. Peter came. Of course he came. He swung up into that nightmare, terrified, with the woman he loved held over a fatal height by a laughing madman. And he tried to talk. He tried to bargain. He tried to do what he always did, which was find the angle, find the save, be fast enough and smart enough and strong enough to fix it the way he always fixed it. And the Goblin let her go. She fell. And Peter did the only thing his body knew how to do. He fired a web, reached out across that black gulf of air and shot a line down after her, and it caught her. It actually caught her, snapped taut around her falling body. And for one single heartbeat, Peter felt the wild, electric relief of having made it, of being fast enough, of having saved her the way he'd saved 1,000 strangers. And then he pulled her up, and he understood what he'd done. Because a body falling that fast, stopped that suddenly, by a line that unforgiving. The stop is its own kind of violence. The whiplash. The sudden, brutal halt of all that speed. Gwen Stacy was already gone before he reeled her in. The fall would have killed her, maybe. But it's also horribly possible that the web did. That the very thing that made Peter a hero, the thing he'd invented with his own genius, the power he used to save people, that it was his own web line, his own desperate save that snapped her neck. He never got to know for sure. And that not knowing is its own special hell. Did the Goblin kill her? Did the fall kill her? Did Peter kill her, trying to save her, with the exact gift that defined him? The story refuses to give him a clean answer, because the universe in Peter Parker's life is never in the business of clean answers. It only deals in the worst available version of every question. So now run the full math of it. Captain Stacy, dying, asked Peter to protect Gwen. It was the last thing the man ever wanted. And not long after, Peter is holding Gwen's body on a rooftop.
having failed the dead man's final request in the most absolute way imaginable, possibly by his own hand, possibly with his own power. The girl who saw him, the girl who chose him.
The first time since Ben that he let himself believe he could be happy. And the universe waited for exactly that, for him to lower his guard and want something. And then it took her, and it made sure he'd never be certain whether he was the one who pulled the trigger. This is the moment that ends Peter Parker's youth. Whatever was left of the boy after Ben, and there was still some optimism in him, still some belief that if he was good enough and fast enough, he could outrun the tragedy. It died on that bridge with Gwen. He learned the lesson he'd been circling his entire life, and this time it went all the way in. That being the hero does not save the people you love. That sometimes being the hero is the thing that gets them killed. That the mask doesn't protect anyone. It just chooses who's standing close enough to be used against you. What happened next was the closest Peter Parker ever came to becoming one of his own villains. He went after the Goblin with everything, not to capture him, not to bring him to justice, to kill him. For the first and most honest time in his life, Peter wanted a man dead, and he had the power to do it. And the only thing standing between him and crossing that line was a dead uncle's voice and a dead girl's memory of who Peter actually was. He beat Norman Osborn to the edge of death, and then he stopped. Because somewhere in the storm of his grief, he understood that if he did this, if he let the rage finish the job, then Gwen really would have died for nothing. Because the man she loved would have stopped being the man she loved. He pulled back. He chose not to be the monster in the one moment he most wanted to. And the Goblin, refusing to lose even in defeat, made one last move. His own glider, the flying weapon he rode into every battle, came rocketing toward Peter on remote control to skewer him from behind. Peter's spider sense screamed. He dodged, and the glider, with all its lethal momentum, drove straight into Norman Osborn instead. The Green Goblin was killed by his own weapon, by the same kind of self-destroying violence he'd built his whole second life around. Peter didn't kill him, but Peter also didn't have to. The Goblin's hatred circled back around and finished him. The same way Peter's selfishness had once circled back around and finished Ben. The universe in this story has one favorite trick, and it just used it again. The thing you do comes home to you. And here's the wound on top of the wound. The detail that's going to detonate years from now. Norman Osborn was Harry's father, Peter's best friend's dad. Now he was dead, and Harry, fragile, insecure, desperate for his father's love, Harry, had lost the only parent he had. And buried somewhere in Harry's grief was a seed of the suspicion that Spider-Man was responsible. Peter's best friend was about to start hating Peter's other half, the way Gwen had, the way the whole city did. Everyone Peter loves, sooner or later, ends up hating the thing that's secretly keeping them safe. It's the curse under all the other curses. Hold it, Harry is not done with this story, not even close. For a while after Gwen, Peter wasn't really alive. He went through the motions of his life like a man underwater, showing up, fighting, swinging, breathing, but with the lights mostly off behind his eyes. Grief like that doesn't end. It just changes shape. It goes from a fire to a weight, something you learn to carry instead of something that's actively burning you. And the carrying becomes so constant that you forget you're doing it. That was Peter for a long time. A young man carrying. But there was someone who didn't let him sink all the way down, and she came from the most unexpected direction. Mary Jane Watson.
Now, if you'd met Mary Jane early in the story, you'd have written her off, the same way Peter almost did. She breezed in as the bombshell, the gorgeous, vivacious party girl, all sparkle and deflection, a redhead who seemed to treat the whole world like a stage she was performing on. Aunt May had practically tried to set them up, and Peter, a serious young man drowning in serious things, assumed there was nothing underneath all that dazzle, just noise, just shine. He was wrong. He was so wrong, and the way he was wrong is one of the most quietly devastating things in the whole story. Because Mary Jane was at the apartment the night Gwen died. She was there, in the aftermath, when Peter came home hollowed out. And the party girl, the one everybody thought was all surface, she didn't run from his grief. She stayed.
The careless laughter she wore like a costume turned out to be exactly that. A costume. A mask. Mary Jane Watson had a whole interior life of pain and instability behind the sparkle. A broken home, a runaway father, a habit of performing happiness so relentlessly that nobody ever thought to check whether she was actually happy. She wore a mask too. She'd just never had to put on a literal one. Do you see why they fit? Peter spent his whole life hiding his real self behind a face the world was allowed to see. So did she. Two people who'd both learned, for completely different reasons, that the safest thing to do with your real heart is to keep it behind something brighter. When they finally found each other, really found each other, it was two people taking the mask off in front of someone for the first time. He didn't have to perform for her. She didn't have to perform for him. After a lifetime of locked rooms, Peter Parker met the one person who already knew what it was like to live behind a door. That's the love that lasts, not the first one, the one that comes after you've been broken and have stopped pretending you're not. But I'm getting ahead of myself, because before we get to the best thing that ever happened to him, we have to go through one of the strangest and darkest. And it starts with something that should have been wonderful: a new suit. Peter got pulled, along with a lot of Earth's heroes, into a faraway conflict. The details don't matter as much as what he brought home. His costume had been damaged, and he found what looked like a machine that could generate a replacement. And out came a sleek black suit with a white spider on the chest. It was better than anything he'd ever had. It responded to his thoughts. It could shapeshift, produce its own webbing, mimic any clothing he imagined. It made him stronger, sharper, more efficient. After a lifetime of homemade gear and shoestring budgets, Peter finally had a costume worthy of his power. And for a while, it was incredible. He felt better in it, faster, more capable. He'd wake up rested, even on nights he didn't remember sleeping much. The suit was everything. The suit was alive. That's the thing he didn't know. It wasn't a machine's product. It was a creature, an alien organism, a symbiote, something that bonded to a host and fed on more than it let on. And what it fed on, slowly, quietly, was Peter. While he slept, the suit was taking him out into the night, doing things, using his body. And worse than the lost hours, it was working on him from the inside, feeding his anger, amplifying his aggression, turning the volume up on every dark impulse Peter had spent his entire life keeping in check. Because here's what the symbiote understood about Peter Parker, the same thing the Goblin understood, the same thing the world kept circling. There was rage in this man. There had to be. You don't lose your uncle to your own carelessness. Lose the love of your life on a bridge. Get hated by an entire city for saving it, and not have a furnace of anger somewhere deep down that you've welded shut. Peter kept that furnace locked because Ben taught him what power without restraint becomes. The symbiote went looking for that furnace, and it opened the door, and it started feeding the fire. He got crueler, harder. He hit people harder than he needed to. He took risks he never would have. The patience and the mercy that had always defined him, the thing that stopped him from killing the Goblin even in his worst grief, started to thin out. The people around him noticed. He was becoming someone they didn't recognize, someone colder, someone with an edge that hadn't been there before. The suit was making him more powerful and less Peter. And the horror of it is how good it felt while it was happening. The seduction of just letting the anger out, of stopping the exhausting, lifelong work of being the better man. This is the closest the story ever comes to telling you who Peter would be without the sentence Ben wrote in his blood. And it's not pretty. Strip away the restraint, the mercy, the responsibility, and underneath is a grieving, furious young man who's been wronged 1,000 times and would very much like to stop holding back. The suit didn't put the darkness in him. It just turned off the part of him that kept the darkness leashed. When he finally figured out what the suit was, that it was alive, that it was controlling him, that it was changing who he was, he tried to take it off, and it wouldn't let go. It clung to him, fought him, because by now it didn't want to just be worn. It wanted to be him. A creature that had finally found a host strong enough and good enough to be worth taking over completely. And it would not surrender that without a war. He got rid of it in the end. There's a famous scene of him driving it off with sound in the bell tower of a church of all places, the alien recoiling from the deafening toll of the bells, while Peter, exhausted and half-mad, finally tears himself free of the thing that had been quietly eating his soul. He won. He chose himself, the real self, the harder self, the one that has to do the exhausting work of being good. He rejected the easy power. But you don't get to make a choice like that for free. Not in this story. Because the symbiote, cast off, rejected, didn't die. It went looking for a new host, and it found one in a man named Eddie Brock, a journalist whose career and life had collapsed, who blamed Spider-Man for ruining him, who was sitting in that very church praying for the strength to deal with how much he hated Peter Parker. The alien, equally heartbroken at being thrown away, equally consumed with hatred for the man who'd rejected it, bonded with Brock. And the two of them, a man who hated Spider-Man and a creature that hated Spider-Man, fused into one being that knew everything the symbiote had learned during its time on Peter, including the one thing no enemy was ever supposed to know. It knew Peter was Spider-Man. The suit had been there. It had lived inside the secret. And now it had given that secret to a man who wanted Peter destroyed. They became Venom. A twisted, hulking, grinning, dark reflection of Spider-Man himself. Same powers, same webs, but bigger, crueler, fueled by pure personal hatred. And the reason Venom is one of the most disturbing enemies Peter ever faces is that Venom isn't really a stranger. Venom is Peter's own darkness, the thing he refused to become, given a body and a grudge, and sent back to hunt him. Every time Peter looks at Venom, he's looking at the version of himself he barely managed not to be. That's the pattern again, isn't it? The mirror. Peter's whole rogues gallery is just reflections, and the worst of them are the ones made from his own discarded pieces. He threw away the darkness, and the darkness found someone to wear, and came back wearing his face. And yet, through all of it, the grief and the suit and the darkness wearing his face, Peter and Mary Jane kept finding their way back to each other. Because that's what real love does in this story. It refuses the reasonable terms. They got married. After everything, after Gwen, after years of near misses and breakups and the constant terror that loving Peter Parker was a death sentence, Mary Jane stood across from him and chose him with her eyes open. She knew the truth by now. She knew about the mask, the danger, the locked rooms, the long list of people the city's hatred and the villain's grudges had already cost him. She married him anyway. She married Peter and Spider-Man both. The whole impossible package, knowing exactly what it might cost her. For a moment,
And I want you to hold on to this moment because the story gives Peter so few of them. He was happy. Genuinely happy. He had a partner who saw all of him, who'd taken off her own mask so he could take off his, who came home to the same apartment and worried when he was late for the real reason, and loved him for it. After a lifetime of locked doors, Peter Parker got to live with someone on the inside. But you already know the rule. The universe in this story has been waiting the whole time for Peter to be happy. It's never once let him keep it. And the better the happiness, the more carefully the universe sharpens what it's going to use to take it away. First it came for Harry. Remember Harry Osborn, Peter's best friend, the lonely rich kid, the boy whose father became the Green Goblin and died on his own glider. Harry never recovered from that. How could he? His father was a monster, his father was dead, and somewhere underneath it all, Harry came to believe Spider-Man was responsible. And Harry didn't know Spider-Man was Peter, which means Peter had to stand next to his grieving best friend and absorb that hatred too. The same way he'd absorbed Gwen's. The same way he absorbed everyone's. The locked room again. The unbearable closeness of someone you love hating the secret half of you. And then Harry did the thing that broke Peter's heart in a way the villains never could. He picked up his father's legacy. The formula, the glider, the mania. Harry became the second Green Goblin. The boy Peter had laughed with, lived with, loved like a brother, put on the green mask and came after him, his mind unraveling along the exact same fault lines his father's had, the family curse passing down like an inheritance. So now Peter had to fight his best friend. Not a stranger, not a mirror image scientist, not an alien, his actual best friend. The person who'd been there for the worst nights of his life, wearing the costume that had murdered the love of Peter's life. Every punch was a betrayal of a friendship. Every battle was Peter trying to save a man who was trying to kill him, trying to reach the Harry he knew underneath the goblin the formula had made. And in the end, the formula did to Harry what it had done to Norman. It killed him. The chemicals that gave the Osborns their power were poison, and they finally took Harry down. But here's the part that makes it bearable, the small mercy the story allows. In his final moments, Harry came back. The goblin loosened its grip, and the real Harry surfaced one last time, and he saved Peter. He chose his friend over his madness, right at the end. He died as Harry Osborn, not as the Green Goblin. It's the rarest thing in Peter's life, a tragedy with a sliver of grace in it. He lost his best friend, but his best friend came home before the end. After Ben, after Gwen, after a lifetime of the universe taking people in the ugliest way available, Harry got to die as himself, choosing Peter. It wasn't enough, it's never enough, but it was something, and Peter had learned to live on something. And then the story did the cruelest thing it had ever done to him. It didn't take someone he loved. It took him. It took Peter from Peter. This is the part of the story people argue about to this day, and I'm telling you about it because it might be the most psychologically brutal thing that ever happened to this character, even if it doesn't involve a single funeral. It started with a man who looked exactly like Peter Parker. Same face, same voice, same memories, same love for Mary Jane, same grief for Ben, same vivid recollection of every defining moment of Peter's life. Because years earlier, an old enemy had created a clone of Peter, a perfect copy, grown from Peter's own cells, given Peter's own memories. And that clone had been thought dead, and now he was back, alive, walking around with Peter's entire life inside his head, feeling every bit as much like the real Peter Parker as the real Peter Parker did.
And the question that this raised, the question that nearly destroyed Peter's sense of self entirely, was simple and unanswerable. Which one is real? Think about what that does to a person. The clone remembered loving Aunt May. He remembered the exact weight of Ben's death. He remembered Gwen on the bridge. He carried the sentence about power and responsibility just as deeply, lived by it just as faithfully. From the inside, he was Peter Parker in every way that a person is the sum of their memories and their choices. So if that's true of the copy, if the copy feels every bit as real, as guilty, as loving, as driven, then what exactly makes the original the original? What is a person if a perfect copy of your mind and your wounds is just as much you as you are? There was a long, agonizing stretch where Peter genuinely did not know whether he was the real man or the duplicate, whether his memories were earned or implanted, whether the love he felt for his wife was his own or a copy of someone else's. Imagine waking up and being told that the entire interior life you've been living, your grief, your marriage, your guilt, your name, might belong to someone else, and you might be the fake. That you might be a thing that was grown to imitate a person, walking around mistaking the imitation for a soul. Peter Parker, the man defined more than anything by who he was on the inside, the man who'd kept being the better self even when it cost him everything, was forced to ask whether his inside was even his. It's the deepest cut a story can make in a character like him. You can take everything he loves, but to make him doubt whether the man doing the loving is even real, that's a wound that goes all the way to the floor. The clone, by the way, he took the name Ben. Ben Riley. After the uncle. Of course he did. Because of course the copy loved Ben just as much as the original. And there's something almost unbearably sad in that, in a duplicate honoring a dead man's memory with the name he chose to live under. Both of them haunted by the same loss. Both of them trying to be worthy of the same sentence. Two Peter Parkers, each one carrying the same impossible weight, each one wondering if he was the echo and not the voice. It resolved, eventually, the way these things do, messily, painfully, with loss on the way out. But Peter never came out of it quite the same. Because once you've genuinely doubted whether you're real, you don't fully forget the doubt. Some quiet part of him would always know that the thing he was most sure of, being himself, had once been taken away and handed back, and that the handing back never feels quite as solid as the having. For years after that, Peter kept the secret the way he always had, white-knuckled, exhausting, total. The mask stayed on. Aunt May, the woman who raised him, who'd already buried her husband, still didn't know that the nephew she worried over was the masked figure she read about in the papers. The locked room stayed locked. It was the load-bearing wall of his entire life. Nobody close to him knew, because knowing made them targets. Because the one time the worst enemies had learned the truth, the people he loved had ended up on bridges and in coffins. And then, in a moment of conviction, in the middle of a conflict that split the entire hero community down the middle, Peter Parker did the unthinkable. He took off the mask in front of the entire world. On purpose. In public. He told everyone who he was. The reasons were complicated. There was a fight about whether heroes should register their identities with the government, and Peter, trying to do the principled thing, trying to lead by example, made the choice to stop hiding, to stand up in front of the cameras and say the name. Peter Parker. Spider-Man. After a lifetime of the most careful secrecy any human being ever maintained, he tore down the wall himself, because in the moment, it felt like the responsible thing to do. And I want you to feel the weight of that, because it's so deeply him. The whole tragedy of Peter Parker is that he keeps trying to do the right thing, and the universe keeps charging him for it. He unmasked because he thought it was honest, because he thought it was brave, because the sentence about power and responsibility had never once let him take the easy road. And it was the single worst mistake he could possibly make, for the oldest reason in his story. Because now everyone knew, every enemy he'd ever made, every grudge, every villain, every crime boss he'd ever humiliated, they all knew his name and his face, and worst of all, they knew exactly who he loved. The thing he'd protected with the mask for his entire life, the safety of the people closest to him, he'd just handed away to the whole world in a single press conference. It didn't take long. A powerful man Peter had crossed put out the order, and a sniper took the shot. The bullet was meant for Peter. It found Aunt May. May, the woman who'd chosen a grieving orphan and raised him with everything she had. The last living link to Ben, to his childhood, to the back porch and the quiet lessons. The person who'd worried over him his whole life without ever knowing what she was really worried about. She lay dying because Peter had taken off his mask, because once again, the same horrible loop the story had been running since the very beginning. Peter Parker tried to do the right thing, and the people he loved paid the bill. He'd let a thief go, and it killed Ben. He'd let himself love, and it killed Gwen. He'd taken off the mask to be honest, and now it was killing May. The lesson never changed. It just kept finding new ways to be true. The more responsibly Peter behaved, the more it cost the people he loved. He did everything. Of course he did. He had access to the smartest people on Earth, the best technology, every miracle medicine in existence, and he begged at all of them, and none of it could save her. May was dying, and there was no version of his power, not the strength, not the speed, not the genius that invented the webs, that could stop it. The man who'd spent his whole life saving strangers could not save the one woman who'd saved him. And that's when the worst offer of his life arrived. A figure approached him, something old and powerful and patient, a devil in everything but name. And the devil offered Peter a trade. He could save Aunt May. He could pull her back from death, undo the bullet, give Peter back the woman who raised him. But there was a price, and it was the cruelest price the universe had ever set, because it was perfectly designed to take the one thing Peter had managed against all odds to keep: his marriage, his life with Mary Jane. The devil's terms were this: May lives, and in exchange, Peter and Mary Jane's marriage is erased. Not ended, erased. Taken out of existence as if it had never happened. The love rewritten out of the world. The years of being truly known by another person folded up and made to have never been. The one relationship that had let Peter take off his mask, the partnership that had survived Gwen's ghost and the symbiote's darkness and the clone's nightmare, the single good thing the universe had let him hold on to. That was the cost of his aunt's life. Think about the shape of that choice. It's the whole story compressed into one impossible moment. Peter can save the person he's responsible for, the aunt, the family, the one who raised him, the oldest debt he carries, but only by sacrificing the person who makes him happy. He cannot have both. He never gets to have both. The story has been telling him that since the night Ben died, and now it makes him choose it out loud, with his own mouth, knowing exactly what he's giving up. And here's the thing that tells you everything about who Peter Parker is. He did it. He and Mary Jane both did it.
They sat with the impossible math, the two of them, the way they'd faced everything else, together for the last time, knowing it was the last time, even as they decided to make it so. And they chose to save May. To give up their own happiness, their own love, their own life together, so that the woman who raised an orphan could keep breathing. Mary Jane, in the end, was the one who made the deal real. She whispered something to the devil that we never fully hear, some last private thing between two people about to be unwritten from each other's lives. And then it was done. May opened her eyes, alive, healthy, with no memory of any of it. And the marriage was gone. The years of being known erased. Mary Jane walked back out into a world where she had never been Peter's wife. And Peter walked back into a life where the best thing that ever happened to him simply hadn't. He didn't even get to keep the grief. That's the part that hollows me out. When Gwen died, at least Peter got to mourn her. The loss was real. It was his. He could carry it. But this was worse, because the loss got taken too. He sacrificed his marriage to save his aunt, and then the universe didn't even let him remember it clearly, didn't let him hold the wound, just quietly rewrote the world so the love had never been. He gave up the one thing that made him happy, and he didn't even get to keep the scar to prove it had been his. That is the deepest expression of who Peter Parker is. And it's almost too much to look at directly. Because a different man, a lesser man, would have let May die. Would have chosen his own happiness, his own marriage, his own love, and grieved his aunt and gotten to keep his life. Most people would understand that choice. Most people would forgive it. But Peter Parker has never once in his entire existence been able to choose himself over the responsibility. Not when a thief ran past him and it cost him Ben. That one time, the one time he chose himself, he learned the lesson so completely that he never made the mistake again. Not even when making it would have saved the only joy he had left. So he gave up the love of his life to honor a debt to the woman who raised him. And he didn't get a medal. He didn't get understanding. He didn't even get to remember it properly. He just got to keep doing what he always does. Wake up, put on the mask, go save a city that doesn't know his name. Alone. So let's stop the timeline for a moment, because we've watched a lot of things happen to this man, and I want to talk about the thing underneath all of them. The question I promised you at the start. What does it actually cost to do the right thing? Every single time, forever. And what does it do to a person who's decided he isn't allowed to stop? The first thing you notice, if you really look, is the loneliness. It's everywhere in his story, threaded through every triumph. Peter Parker is one of the most beloved figures in his entire world. There are children who idolize him, lives that exist because he was there, a whole city that, in its quieter and more honest moments, knows it owes him everything. And he is profoundly, structurally alone, because the love flows one direction. The city loves a mask, the strangers he saves love a symbol, and the man underneath, the actual Peter, the one with the dead uncle and the empty side of the bed and the aunt he can't tell the truth to, that man goes home to an apartment where nobody can fully know him, because knowing him is dangerous, because everyone who's ever gotten close enough to know him has paid for it. He turned that loneliness into a joke. Have you ever noticed that? It's one of the most quietly heartbreaking things about him. Spider-Man never shuts up in a fight. He's cracking wise, riffing, taunting, making terrible puns at the worst possible moments. And most people read it as confidence, as charm, as the lightness of a hero who's got it all under control. It's not. It's armor. It's the mask under the mask. Think about when the joke started. A shy, bullied kid who could never say the right thing, who took the shoves in the hallway in silence, who watched the cool kids be funny and witty,
and never managed it himself. And then he put on a mask, and suddenly nobody could see him blush. Nobody could connect the words to the frightened boy, and for the first time in his life, he could say anything. The mask didn't just hide his face, it freed his voice. Spider-Man is the version of Peter Parker who finally gets to be funny, gets to be brave with his mouth, gets to talk back to the world that spent years talking down to him. The jokes are the sound of a powerless kid who finally found a place where he was allowed to be loud. And there's something else in the humor, something darker and more human. When you're terrified, and Peter is always at least a little terrified because his whole life has taught him that the people he loves can be taken at any second. Sometimes the only way to keep functioning is to laugh at the thing trying to kill you. The jokes are how he stays standing. They're how a man who's lost as much as he's lost gets back up the next morning and does it again. You make the monster a punchline so it can't make you a coward. Now here's the question that the whole story keeps circling, the one that the clone nightmare made literal, but that's true even without it. Is he Peter Parker wearing a Spider-Man costume? Or is he Spider-Man wearing a Peter Parker costume? It sounds like a riddle. It's actually the central tension of his entire existence. Because there are stretches where the human life feels like the disguise. Where Peter, the job and the rent and the relationships, is the thing he puts on to move through the daylight. And Spider-Man, the rooftops and the rescues and the war, is who he really is. And there are other stretches where it's the reverse, where the mask is the burden and the costume is the cage. And all he wants is to be Peter, just Peter, a guy from Queens with a camera and a girl and a normal Tuesday. He never fully resolves it. He spends his whole life being two people and never getting to be just one. And the exhaustion of that, of always having to be somewhere else, always having to lie, always having to disappear mid-sentence, is a weight the city never sees when it looks up and cheers for the swinging figure overhead. And this is where I have to tell you the thing that actually makes Peter Parker special. Because it isn't the powers, the same way Aaron wasn't special for the Titan. The powers are almost beside the point. There are stronger heroes. There are smarter ones, richer ones, ones who are gods or aliens or billionaires with armories. Peter Parker is none of that. Peter Parker is a kid from a working-class neighborhood in Queens who can't pay his rent on time, who got dumped, who failed classes because he was out saving lives, who had to choose between catching a bus and catching a criminal, who knows exactly what it costs to put dinner on the table for a sick relative. That's the secret of him. He's the hero with your problems. The one who saves the world and then has to figure out how to afford the train home. Every other hero you look up at. Peter Parker you look across at. He's eye level. He's one of us. And the reason that matters, the reason it's the entire heart of why his story has outlasted nearly everyone else's, is that it means his heroism isn't the easy kind. When a god decides to save people, it costs the god very little. When a kid from Queens with rent due and an aunt to feed and a heart that's already been broken 3 times decides to spend his night pulling strangers out of a fire instead of resting, knowing the strangers will read tomorrow that he probably started it, that costs everything. That's a choice, a real one made by a real-sized person over and over at real personal expense. He could stop. That's the thing you have to hold on to understand him. At any point, he could stop. He could hang up the mask, take a job that pays, marry someone the danger could never reach, grow old quietly, let the city find some other protector. The sentence about power and responsibility isn't a law of physics. Nothing forces him. He chooses it. Every single morning, the same way he chooses to get back up after every loss. And he has lost more than almost anyone. Ben, Gwen, Harry. His own certainty about whether he was real, his marriage erased so completely he can't even properly grieve it. Person after person after person, the universe taking and taking, running the same cruel loop where doing right gets the people he loves hurt. and he gets back up. Every time. That's the whole thing. That's Peter Parker in one sentence. He gets knocked down by a universe that seems almost personally committed to teaching him that goodness doesn't pay, and he gets back up and is good anyway. Not because it works, not because he's rewarded, not because anybody thanks him. He's learned, more thoroughly than any person should ever have to, that being the hero does not protect the people you love and does not earn you a single thing. And he does it anyway, because somewhere a long time ago, a gentle man on a back porch taught a frightened boy that the power to help and the duty to help are the same thing. And that boy decided he would rather carry that weight until it crushed him than ever again be the person who let a thief run past because it wasn't his job. There's a kind of stubbornness in that, which is almost holy and almost insane. And it's the exact same trait, just like Aaron's was, the refusal to quit, the thing that makes him impossible to break. In a man like Aaron, aimed at the wrong horizon and fed on enough grief, that refusal ends a world. In Peter Parker, aimed at a fire escape at 3 a.m. over a city that hates him, that same refusal saves one. The trait is the same. The difference is entirely in where it's pointed, and what it's willing to sacrifice. And Peter, every single time, points it away from himself and toward the stranger, and pays the cost out of his own life rather than anyone else's. He is the patron saint of the people who do the right thing and get nothing for it. The ones who show up and clean up and carry the weight and don't get thanked and come back the next day anyway. That's who his story is actually for. Not the strongest, the most tired. The ones still standing only because they decided a long time ago that standing back up is just what you do. And just when you think the universe has run out of ways to hurt this man, just when you think it's taken his uncle, his first love, his best friend, his certainty about his own soul, and his marriage, it finds the one thing it hasn't taken yet. It takes his body, with him still in it. This is the darkest chapter in the whole story, and it starts with the oldest mirror Peter has. Otto Octavius, Dr. Octopus, the brilliant scientist who was always the version of Peter without the conscience, the intellect untethered from Ben's lessons. By this point in his life, Otto was dying, his body, ruined by years of his own experiments, finally giving out. And a dying genius with Peter's intellect and none of Peter's mercy did the most monstrous thing imaginable. He found a way to swap their minds. Otto put his own consciousness into Peter Parker's healthy body. And he pushed Peter's mind into Otto's failing, dying one. So now picture it. Peter Parker, the real Peter, the soul, the man, is trapped inside a broken body on a deathbed, watching a villain wear his face, watching Dr. Octopus walk around in Peter Parker's skin, go home to Peter Parker's life, look at the people Peter loves through Peter's own eyes. And Peter can't stop it. He fights the way he always fights. He claws at the impossible from inside a failing shell, and he loses. Otto's body dies with Peter trapped inside it. From the outside, Peter Parker simply died. Spider-Man was dead, and the thing wearing his body knew it had won. But here is where the story does something extraordinary, something that turns the whole tragedy into the most unexpected proof of who Peter actually was. Because in the last instant before Peter's mind was extinguished in that dying body, he did the one thing he had spent his entire life learning how to do. He reached across, into his own stolen body, into the mind of the enemy who'd taken everything from him. And he made Otto live his memories. Every single one. Ben in the warehouse, Gwen on the bridge, the sentence about power and responsibility, the whole crushing weight of what it means to be Peter Parker. He forced his greatest enemy to feel, all at once, the entire moral education of his life.
and it changed Otto. The villain, drowning in the full flood of Peter's memories, understood for the first time what he'd stolen. He understood the responsibility that came welded to the power. And Otto Octavius made a vow. To be Spider-Man. To be a better Spider-Man than Peter ever was. To prove that he, with his superior intellect, could do the job better. Now think about what that means for a second, because it's genuinely disturbing. For a long stretch, the Spider-Man swinging through the city wasn't Peter Parker.
It was Otto Octavius in Peter's body, trying to be a hero and convinced he was doing it better. And the unsettling part is that in some narrow ways, he was. He was more efficient, more ruthless. He set up surveillance. He built an army of helpers. He beat villains Peter never could. He even earned a doctorate, dated, built a life, all while wearing Peter's face and calling himself the superior Spider-Man.
But he wasn't superior. That was the whole point the story was making, slowly, painfully. Because all the intellect and efficiency in the world couldn't replicate the one thing that actually made Peter Parker who he was. Otto looked at a single life and did the math on whether it was worth saving. Peter never did the math. Peter saved everyone, the worthwhile and the worthless, the grateful and the hateful. Because the moment you start deciding who deserves saving is the moment you become the thief running past in the hallway. Otto's whole philosophy was that some people don't count. Peter's whole soul was the refusal of that idea. And eventually, Otto hit a problem he could not solve, a sacrifice he could not make, a person he decided wasn't worth the cost. And he realized, in the end, that he could never actually be Peter Parker. Because being Peter Parker means there is no such thing as a person who isn't worth the cost. So Otto did the last good thing he had in him. He stepped aside, he erased himself, and gave Peter his body, his life, his name back. The villain who stole everything understood, finally, that the one thing he could never steal was the thing that made the man worth stealing from. You can take Peter Parker's body, you can take his face and his strength and his life, but you cannot become him because what he is isn't in the body, it's in the choice. And the choice was never available for sale. Peter came back to his own life to find it both wrecked and somehow built up, to find pieces of himself rearranged by a stranger who'd worn his skin. And he did what he always does. He picked up the pieces, he cleaned up the mess, he got back to work. The man had literally died, had his body stolen, had a villain live his life. And he came back, and the very first thing he did was start fixing what had been broken while he was gone. Because that's the only thing he's ever known how to do. And I want you to notice the pattern one final time, because it's the spine of his entire existence. Every great enemy, a mirror. The scientist without a conscience. The good man turned monster by his own ambition. The discarded darkness given a body and a grudge. The perfect copy who felt just as real. And finally, the enemy who literally became him and proved, by failing, exactly what couldn't be copied. Over and over, the story holds up a reflection of Peter and asks, what makes you different from this? And the answer, every single time, comes down to the same thing. Not the power, the willingness to pay for it himself, so that no one else has to. So now you've lived it, the whole of it. From a furious, invisible kid at the back of a classroom, to a man who died and came back inside the body of his greatest enemy. And the question that's been waiting at the end of this road the entire time, the one I promised you'd have to face, is finally sitting here in front of us, and there's no clean way around it. What did it actually cost? And was it worth it? Because the easy answer, he's the hero, he saved the city, of course it was worth it, look at all the lives, is true, and it's also a way of refusing to look at him. It's the headline version. It's what the strangers say when they look up. And Peter spent his whole life being looked at by people who never saw the bill. The city saw the saves. It never saw the empty chair where Ben should have been. It never saw the bridge.
It never saw a man giving up the only love that ever truly knew him so that an old woman could keep breathing, and then not even getting to remember the love clearly enough to mourn it. If we close the book by just calling him the hero, we do the same thing the city did. We take the saves and skip the cost. And we miss the only thing that ever made his story matter, which is that the cost was the story. The saving was never free. It was paid for every single time out of one specific, particular, working-class, broken-hearted human life by a man who could have stopped and never once did. He wanted, at the very beginning, two simple things: to matter and to be seen. That was the whole wish a lonely boy made in the dark. And the universe, with its terrible sense of humor, granted both in the cruelest possible shape. He mattered more than almost anyone alive, and the world that needed him most spent his whole career calling him a menace. He got seen, but only the mask, only the symbol, never the man. He asked to be looked at, and he got worshipped and hated, and through all of it remained completely, structurally alone. He got everything he wished for, and not one piece of it in the form he wanted it. That's the real tragedy of Peter Parker, and it's a quieter one than Aaron's, but it cuts just as deep. Aaron wanted to be free and learned the cage was inside him. Peter wanted to do the right thing and learned the right thing has no bottom. That responsibility, once you accept it, is not a debt you can ever finish paying. There's always one more fire, one more night, one more stranger who'll read tomorrow that you probably started it. He kept thinking, the way we all think, that if he was just good enough, fast enough, responsible enough, he'd reach the end of it. He'd save enough lives to balance the scale and finally get to rest. And the scale never balanced, because that's not how it works. The weight of being able to help is not a thing you carry to a finish line. It's a thing you carry until you set it down for good. And Peter Parker has never, not once, been willing to set it down. And here's the part that refuses to let me file his life away as simply sad. The thing that turns the tragedy into something closer to grace. Underneath all of it, the losses, the loneliness, the hatred, the bill that never stopped coming due, was a person who loved so much it cost him the world, and who decided every single time that this was an acceptable price. Most people, handed Peter's life, would have grown bitter, would have looked at a universe that punished every good deed and concluded the lesson was to stop doing good deeds. He drew the opposite conclusion. He looked at a world that took Ben for his carelessness and decided to never be careless again. He looked at a world that took Gwen for his love and kept loving. He looked at a city that hated him for saving it and kept saving it. The losses didn't teach him to protect himself. They taught him to protect everyone else harder. That's not the math of an ordinary man. It's the math of a person who decided, on the worst night of his life, that the antidote to helplessness wasn't power. It was responsibility. And he never wavered from it again, no matter what it cost, no matter who was charging. He could have just lived. That's the unbearable thing, the same unbearable thing at the bottom of every story like his. At any point, he could have stopped. He could have been a brilliant scientist with a good job and a wife and a quiet apartment and a normal life full of ordinary Tuesdays. He saw that life. He held it more than once. He got married, and the universe took it. He doubted he was even real and chose to keep being good as if he were. He died and came back, and the first thing he did was get back to work. Some part of him decided, a long time ago in a warehouse next to a man he'd let live, that a comfortable life bought by looking away was worse than an exhausting life spent never looking away again. And he walked toward the exhausting one every single day with his whole heart, knowing exactly what it would cost. People will argue forever about whether the sentence Ben taught him was a gift or a curse. Whether responsibility like that is the finest thing a person can carry, or a slow way of letting the world eat you alive one good deed at a time. I don't think the story wants you to settle it. I think it wants you to sit in the discomfort of not knowing. The same discomfort Peter sat in his whole life. The question of whether the most responsible person in the world is allowed to be happy, and whether the answer is no. And whether he kept going anyway, precisely because the answer was no. Because someone has to, and he was the one who couldn't make himself stop. And maybe that's the truest thing about him. Peter Parker wasn't special because he could climb walls, or lift a bus, or feel danger a half second before it came. He was special because he was small, because he was one of us, a kid with rent due and a heart that kept getting broken, and no good reason on earth to keep getting up. And he got up anyway. He's not a god you look up to. He's a mirror you look across at. He's the part of all of us that's tired and overlooked and carrying more than anyone knows, and shows up anyway, and cleans up the mess, and doesn't get thanked, and comes back tomorrow. He's the proof that you don't have to be powerful to be good. You just have to refuse to look away, and then refuse again, and again. Forever. We started at the back of a classroom with a boy wishing he were someone else. We end on a fire escape at 3 a.m. with a man holding a mask in his hands, more himself than he has ever been, and more alone, and getting ready to put it back on. The boy got his wish. He became someone else. He became the someone an entire city needed and never properly thanked. And he paid for it with nearly everything a person can pay. And he would do it all again, because the only thing he ever truly couldn't survive was the version of himself that didn't. He spent his whole life trying to make the suffering of strangers a short story, to swing in and fix it fast, and swing away before the cost caught up with him. And it never worked, because the things that matter don't resolve in a single night. They echo. They take the long way. The lives he saved kept living. The losses he carried kept aching. The good he did kept rippling out into a city that would never know his name. His whole life was one long telling of a story he kept hoping he could keep short, and the meaning of it only ever arrived the way meaning always does. Slowly, in the carrying, over the whole long road. Thank you for walking that road with me, all the way from a frightened kid in the back row to a fallen hero in a stolen body, and back to a man on a fire escape, putting the mask on one more time. It's a heavy life to follow, and a heavy one to set down. Some people are too big to hold in a sentence, and the only honest way to understand them is to take the long way through. Every loss, every choice, every time they got back up, and let the meaning arrive slowly, the way it always does. So we'll leave him there, mask in hand, one foot on the railing, looking out over a city full of people who'll never know what he gave up to keep their lights on. A short story, told long, because that's the only way a life like his was ever going to be true. The quick version calls him a hero and moves on. The long version is the one that actually understands him, and understanding him was always going to take the whole story to reach. Get back up, Peter. The city's still here. And so, somehow, after all of it, are you.